This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy and TNC chapters throughout the western United States. Guided by science and grounded by decades of collaborative partnerships, the Nature Conservancy has a long-standing legacy of achieving lasting results to create a world where nature and people thrive. During the last week of every month throughout 2025, Mountain and Prairie will be delving into conversations with a wide range of the Nature Conservancy's leaders, partners, collaborators, and stakeholders, highlighting the myriad of conservation challenges, opportunities, and solutions here in the American West and beyond. To learn more about the Nature Conservancy's impactful work in the West and around the world, visit www.nature.org. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Aaron Citron. Aaron is the Associate Director of External Affairs at the Nature Conservancy, where he leads state-level policy engagement across Colorado. His work spans a wide array of conservation priorities, including water management, healthy forests, renewable energy siting, and partnerships with private landowners and tribal nations. Aaron plays a key role in bridging on-the-ground conservation efforts with the legislative and regulatory frameworks that support them. He also helps shape TNC's strategy around climate and energy policy, working to ensure a rapid but responsible transition to renewable infrastructure. Aaron grew up in Tucson, Arizona, where early exposure to the desert landscape and its vital, limited water resources sparked a lifelong interest in the natural world. After studying history and political science at Emory University, he returned west for law school at the University of Arizona, focusing on water and land use law. His career has taken him from local land trusts to national NGOs like the Environmental Defense Fund, always at the intersection of policy, place, and practical impact. Along the way, he's built a reputation for thoughtful, collaborative work that reflects both his legal background and his deep connection to the West. In this conversation, Aaron shares a detailed look at how conservation policy gets made, from coalition building and legislative drafting to navigating complex stakeholder relationships. We talk about examples like Colorado's response to the Clean Water Act rollbacks and new tools to support in-stream flows on the Yampa River. He talks about the balance between urgency and patience, the importance of trust in long-term conservation, and how calm, clear-headed engagement can shape better outcomes. It's a compelling look at the behind-the-scenes work that makes public-facing conservation efforts possible. Be sure to check out the episode notes for a full list of all the topics we discussed and links to everything. A big thanks to Aaron for this conversation, and thank you for listening. Hope you enjoy. All right, Aaron, I should have hit the record button about 10 minutes ago because we've already had quite a good conversation, but super excited to have you here. I've heard your name, and I believe we've been in some of the same rooms back when I was working at Palmer Land Conservancy, but I've never had a conversation with you, and I'm really excited about this. And I always like to hear how people ended up doing this work they do, because there's always a interesting story. And I think about myself when I was sitting at Merrill Lynch in North Carolina and I wanted to do more important work, and I'd see guys like you and I'm like, how did that guy do that? How did he do it? So let's just start at the beginning. Where did you grow up?
Yeah. Well, and thanks for having me. Excited to be here. So I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, and spent really a huge chunk of my life down there. I love the desert, and some of my earliest memories of kind of conservation and the importance of nature, and really for me the importance of water, was spending time at a little place called Sabino Canyon, which is I think it's a national recreation area in Tucson. And my elementary school and middle school were right across the street, like literally across the street. And when I was a little kid, at least a couple times, they'd take the class out. We'd walk across, in a little line into the park there, and they'd take us to the creek to kind of dig around and look for all the critters. And they had, I don't know if it was the teachers or volunteers, but basically naturalists talking about this special desert stream, and how different that is to kind of all the other native biodiversity in the area, and how this kind of little oasis is kind of right at your fingertips. So I still remember those moments, and it's definitely something that's stuck with me for a long time.
And was your family pretty involved in the outdoors? I mean, I know we were talking before we started recording. They were from the east originally, and then moved out west. I mean, was camping and hiking and all that kind of stuff just kind of a baked in part of your youth?
It's funny. It wasn't as much as and I'm not complaining, but I wish it had been a little more. Both my parents came from North Carolina, and they moved out and lived in Southern California for a couple of years before coming to the desert. And before I was born, they have a bunch of photo albums of the two of them at Joshua Tree, where they would go all
cool.
the time. Coming from North Carolina, and then get into this alien landscape of the desert and Joshua Tree. They spent, I don't know how many visits to camp out there. So I always saw pictures of them as little campers. And then I think when my sister and I were born, that got a little more complicated. So
Yeah.
we traveled around Arizona, but we didn't do a ton of camping. I did go starting when I was, maybe, I want to say 10 years old, maybe a little older than that. I started going up to summer camp in Prescott, kind of northern Arizona, every summer until I ended up working there as a camp counselor. I think through my first year of college, I was up there every year, and I did a ton of camping, and rafting and canoeing and hiking and mountain biking, through that summer camp. So I got it a different way, but I spent every summer when I was little 3 weeks, and then when I was older 6 weeks or more up in northern Arizona, exploring through that.
I had Dan Steller, who's the director, Arizona director, on a while back, and in that conversation, in my preparation, I was just struck by the biodiversity in Arizona, because if you haven't spent much time there, you just think about it as being a super dry place. But man, what a diverse, wild landscape. When you think about from where you grew up to like Flagstaff and around the Grand Canyon, I mean, it's just a really magical place that I don't think I think it's underrated as far as like on a national scale when people think about outdoor activities outside of the Grand Canyon.
I couldn't agree more. And I always, when you're a kid, you don't think about any of this stuff. But
Sure.
As I got a little older, you hear quite a bit about the biodiversity, all the kind of important stopover points for birds in southern Arizona. And like you mentioned, the difference in landscape and ecology from the southern border up to the northern border, with the Mogollon Rim kind of cutting the state in half, is fascinating. And it's really, really different. And I don't think I realized, it's a little hard to love, maybe, especially southern Arizona. And I grew up there, so I loved it. I went to college in the East and came back for law school at the University of Arizona. And a lot of other kids in my class kind of hated it. They're like, oh, it's so dry and gray and brown. And it was kind of interesting to see it through their eyes. And many of them, not all of them, by the end started to embrace it. And you kind of have to switch the way you look at it, and realize that it's not as green, but there's really, pockets of life throughout. And it's kind of been the same experience bringing my wife there. I mean, she grew up in Nicaragua. She's lived all over the world. And obviously that's a much wetter, greener climate than the Sonoran Desert. And, after her first visit, I think she was not sold. And now we go back at least once a year to visit family. And I think now she gets it, and she understands how beautiful and special it is.
Did that time on the East Coast in Georgia, it was Georgia, right?
Georgia,
Emory?
yeah.
Yeah. Did that make you appreciate it even more? Like kind of realize what you were missing how, like, being able to compare the two, I guess?
It did. And I remember, this might've been my freshman year. It was at Emory in Atlanta, and it's a beautiful campus in the trees, really green. But when I'd fly home for breaks, it just kind of felt like I could breathe a little bit. You can see to the horizon. You're not surrounded. Other people would think this is crazy because you've got all the trees everywhere, and that's wonderful. But when I would come home, I'd sit on my back patio, and you literally can see all the way across the city. You can see the mountains kind of surrounding that basin. And it's a place that I feel really kind of a lot more calm and free. So yes, I loved Georgia for a lot of reasons, but it kind of deepened my connections to the West and to the desert, and happy to still have the opportunity to be out here. Just a little different place and comparatively wet, but obviously still its own kind of desert here in Colorado.
I'll tell you, I grew up in North Carolina in this home, and it always will be home. But my family and I went to Asheville for a week last summer, and I had the oddest feeling that it seemed almost claustrophobic because I couldn't really see anything, and I didn't really know which way is north, west, south. And, it was an odd thing for a guy who is born and bred in North Carolina, generations of people in North Carolina, and all of a sudden it didn't feel normal anymore. And it was in some ways kind of bittersweet because I was like, this used to be my paradise, and now I'm kind of craving the wide open spaces. So anyway, it's funny how all that stuff happened. So you go to Emory, then you decide to go to law school. What was the plan going to law school? I mean, did you have a plan, or was it just kind of like, this is a respectable next step I want to take? What was your thought process?
It was closer to the second thing. I took a number of classes. In college, I focused on history as a history major and cool. a political science minor, and I took a couple of classes on the West. I'm forgetting what the name of the class was, and I took a class called environmental history, and it wasn't the history of the environmental movement, although that was a part of it, but it was about how environmental issues affected historical events. And I wish I could remember the name of the professor because it was a really meaningful experience. And we would talk about early settlers in the United States and how westward expansion was impacted by the difficulty in clearing stumps. So there were all these trees and they wanted to clear it for farm ground, but they didn't have an easy technology to clear stumps. And that, this is a micro sure. issue, but we talked all about that in addition to all the other issues with westward expansion and colonization. But it was fascinating and really thinking about kind of connections between the forests of the East Coast and the New World and shipbuilding and all these different connections that he drew out. So I loved that class, and I really wanted to learn more about the West. And I did take a class on kind of Western history by a guy that I don't think was from the West. And I just thought, I want to get back there. I want to think about and work on natural resources. I'm not a scientist. That's never been my forte. So I might as well go to law school. And that was kind of it. It was just, this seems like an interesting career and a way that I can get into a field that I care about without starting over and becoming an environmental scientist or something like that.
Did you like law school?
I did. I mean, when you're in it, there's definitely moments that you don't enjoy.
Yeah.
I have a really positive perspective on it in retrospect, and I enjoyed it. I went to University of Arizona, it's a relatively small class. I didn't go to U of A when I was growing up, but obviously had connections to it from like the basketball team and things like that. So it was great to kind of have a connection to my local university, and I did like it. I mean, I got to take a bunch of classes that other people might have thought were boring on land use, and I loved kind of property law. I took a mining and public lands class. I took a water law class, and didn't love every minute of it. I realized early on I didn't want to be a litigator. I felt like there's value in that. A lot of my colleagues went on to be litigators and public defenders, but that felt like theater to me, and it's important. It's a real important outcome, and I thought, I like the historical aspect of law, of kind of, there's a story behind all of these issues. And if you can tease out and understand the kind of different perspectives behind it, the historical events that led up to it, maybe you can kind of put the puzzle back together and come up with a good solution. So I really liked that aspect of it. Wasn't sure what to do after law school, but I did enjoy it. I mean, it was a great experience in a lot of cases, and there's not a lot of lawyers in my family. So it was kind of a different path, but really glad I did it, and definitely enjoyed it.
So you're finished, like you think about yourself, third year, getting ready to finish up. What were you thinking? I mean, what was going to be the next step? How did that kind of start coming together for you? Because I would think that I have a bunch of buddies that went to law school and do everything from work at the mega firms to do more conservation type work, and I know that it was quite a. What year was that? What year did you get out?
2007.
Yeah, so that was real estate boom. Not the Great Recession was getting ready to hit. I mean,
Yeah.
what were you thinking?
It's funny because the two summers when I was in law school, I interned with the Nature Conservancy for a
Oh,
couple
cool! I
months
didn't
each
realize
summer.
that.
Yeah. And, I interned there and really worked on, it was slightly different job descriptions the two summers, but worked on some in-stream flow water rights issues, which was kind of new and emerging in Arizona at the time, and was in some. I didn't realize at the time these were really kind of foundational meetings talking about in-stream flow opportunities on the San Pedro River, and also worked a lot on their kind of land portfolio and kind of writing legal memos for the protection teams. And I thought maybe naively, well, they're definitely going to hire me. It was a great situation. They brought me back the next summer. We all got along. I made friends. I'm sure I've got a job. They didn't have a job for me. I think it was a good relationship, but now working for a nonprofit, you can't just hire everybody you want if there's not a job opening. So I was holding out hope that I would get hired and start my career at the Nature Conservancy, where I had such a good time over those summers. That didn't work out. And I honestly, I looked at everything. It wasn't just in conservation. I mean, I interviewed, I flew to San Francisco to interview, didn't get this job, but interviewed to be a clerk with the High Court of American Samoa.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
which I think back a lot, like how different would my life be if I had moved to American Samoa, and spent, I forgot how many years that the job would have been for, but spent a couple of years living out there. Would have been an amazing experience. But I was interviewing there. I interviewed for jobs in Alaska, working on natural resource issues, but ended up initially working for a firm that did mostly eminent domain cases,
Sure, sure.
which oddly enough, I think is a really interesting area because, again, you're kind of looking at the history and it's not always a friendly environment, but I liked the idea of kind of that land use nexus. It wasn't a great fit from it wasn't a great fit from a personality and kind of the role they wanted me to play, but that's where I started, and bounced around a little bit before I found a role with a land trust, Arizona Land and Water Trust down in Tucson.
Oh yeah, they're great. I've spent a little bit of time down there, and I've met some of those folks. And then I remember I met some of them at the Land Trust Alliance rally. And so, what were you doing there? Like, how did you plug in and use your kind of skills at that place?
Yeah, I was hired to basically kick off what was and I think still is called the Desert Rivers Program. And really, they were looking to, and asked me to kind of dig into this more, looking to other states, other regions where the local water trust primarily were able to do environmental water transactions, really looking primarily at the Pacific Northwest, where there's a lot of money for dam um, uh, uh, funding to offset the impacts of dams on the Columbia is being divvied up through this Columbia Basin Water Transactions Program. It's been years since I've looked at the current status of this, but it was going to these local water trusts, and they were working with ranchers in particular to say, we'll pay you to enter into a split season lease to leave a little more water in the stream. We'll pay you to improve your efficiency of your diversion, and that water that was otherwise being pulled into your system can stay in the stream and re-water some of these dry up points. So the question that I was hired to try and answer was, can you do anything like that under Arizona law?
Mm-hmm.
And if so, let's find some willing partners to do some pilot projects and kind of test it out. I worked on and wrote a handbook on kind of Arizona water rights for conservation practitioners that I wonder if people still have on their bookshelf, because we printed a number of copies of this and kind of handed it out to state agencies and other NGO partners. um, and really explored, what's possible under the very different water law system. I mean, the fundamentals are the same, but the way it's implemented are very different in Arizona, really groundwater driven system than it would be in Oregon, for example. So I spent a couple of years doing that, as well as, it was a staff of, I think, 5. So I was also working as one of the conservation easement monitors, going out and driving around and taking photographs at points across the ranches that we helped to steward, working with the county, who were in the process of acquiring lands for their multi-species conservation plan, supported the fundraisers in the event. So it was really a great experience working for a small nonprofit and land trust. But my focus was really on that kind of on the water side, and trying to build that program.
Yeah, I think that's important for people to hear, because I think when you're well established in your career and you're doing great work and you're getting recognition, I think it's important, particularly for young people, to realize, like, yeah, those people who are, mid-career getting recognition, at some point they were kind of doing everything and filling every gap. And if you're working at a small land trust, I mean, I've been there, you do have to kind of do everything. I mean, you have to be willing to, at least. So what was what was the trajectory from there? I mean, we could talk about all this cool stuff you've done for quite a while, but from there to TNC, how many stops along the way?
Well, not too many. And I'll just say, you're right that I had to do everything like everybody did at that small land trust, but I'm so grateful that I got to spend a ton of time with a lot of the farmers and ranchers that we partnered with, because that's just a world that I lived in Tucson. I grew up, an hour away from their ranches, but had never had a connection. And getting that direct, driving around on their ranches and getting their direct perspective is something that I know has still helped and influenced me. It's kind of being able to, I was never the guy who was going to put on cowboy boots and pretend I was, this is my environment. But it was great to get out there and just hear from them directly. So amazing experiences working with all those people. And it's something that I've kind of carried with me. Mm-hmm. And, jumping back to the water transaction side, I mean, the short of it is that there weren't a ton of opportunities with Arizona water law. There were a couple, wasn't a ton. And I found myself thinking, well, if we could tweak the law here, if we could make a little bit of a change there, this environment would be more permissive. And I don't think it'd be too controversial. We're not going to overhaul anything, but if we could make these little tweaks, we could really be in business. Mm-hmm. That's not what land trusts typically do. Although I think that dynamic has changed a little bit, that land trusts are starting to get into the kind of smart advocacy world. But at the time it was a non-starter. And I started looking elsewhere to say, I think I can do more if we have a few more, tools in the toolbox. If we can kind of think about how we can affect change in different ways, in addition to transactional work, where else are the kind of pressure points? I ended up getting a job in Boulder with Environmental Defense Fund, working with Jennifer Pitt, who at the time was really leading the Colorado River engagement. Her focus was on the binational work between the U.S. and Mexico. She's really a amazing career working at that nexus. So I was there for, I want to say 4 years or so at Environmental Defense Fund, and kind of fell into actually doing some unexpected legislative work, working on a bill and advocating on it. And that's a whole nother story. But after about 4 years there, I found the role that I'm currently in with the Nature Conservancy, and I've been there since almost 9.5 years. So only a couple of stops.
No, that's great. That's great. And it makes perfect sense. I always think about career stuff, and when you're going forward, you're just kind of bumbling along and hoping the next step makes sense. And then when you look back, it all miraculously lines up perfectly. Yeah. And that makes perfect sense. So how would you describe your role at TNC?
So my role currently is that I essentially manage our state level policy portfolio. So I kind of lead our government relations team with respect to, again, state level engagement. I don't do as much at the federal level, although a lot of those lines get blurred on certain issues. So that's engagement on all of the conservation priorities that the Nature Conservancy has here, and those being kind of water, mostly on the water quantity side, healthy rivers, kind of protection. We focus a lot on working with private landowners to conserve their properties in different ways. Healthy forests, a lot of that kind of comes through on wildfire mitigation, prescribed fire, forest treatments,
Yep.
as well as restoration. Um, we do a lot of work increasingly with tribal nations to kind of support their voice, choice, and action, and kind of work with them on shared conservation priorities. We have an urban program really in the city of Denver. And a lot of my time these days, and I never would have thought this is what I'd be focused on, but a lot of my time is spent on our climate and energy work. And that's really been, for the last couple of years, focused on the nexus between the need to rapidly accelerate the build out of renewable energy and do it in a way that kind of avoids the worst impacts, potential impacts to lands and water and other conservation priorities. So how can we build this stuff as quickly as possible and do it in a way that we hopefully don't have a ton of regrets about the new footprint? So I lead kind of our engagement with government agencies and advocacy at the state capitol. Also do quite a bit from my background with our Colorado River program, kind of thinking about the Colorado River as a whole system and how kind of the state of Colorado, both what we do from a project perspective and what our decision makers do and think about can affect the larger goals across that 7-state and Mexico and many tribal nations basin.
Well, I love that because I've had a lot of folks on here from TNC, like Peter Gower was on talking about that specific the siting of renewable energy arrays so that it doesn't affect wildlife and all that kind of stuff. And then like Taylor Hawes has been on talking about Colorado River work, and it seems like you're kind of in all those worlds, working behind the scenes so that the on the ground work can take place with all the government assistance. And so I'm really interested in how that process works, but rather than speak in just kind of broad terms about this is how you do it in general, maybe we could talk about a specific project. And
Sure.
and I've researched a bunch of them, and I've seen a bunch that you've worked on. And it's clear from when you described it, you've worked on a lot. But the one that caught my eye was about a few years ago, there was a rollback around the Clean Water Act. And TNC and a bunch of partners, as usual, always partnerships, worked together with government officials to kind of figure out a new solution to protect clean water. Can you just kind of walk us through that project and how that worked out? Because I think that would highlight exactly how this process works.
Sure, and I think it's a good example for the different kinds of roles that the Nature Conservancy can play. Because
Sure.
at the outset, we definitely did not lead that engagement, but were at the table and continue to be at the table in the rulemaking and implementation process to kind of hopefully fill an important gap in the conversation. So as you mentioned, and maybe you've talked about this on here before, during the first Trump administration, they changed the rules that govern the kind of the jurisdictional scope of the Clean Water Act, particularly the 404 program, which is kind of dredge and fill. If you're going to dig up a river or a wetland for a construction project, you have to get a permit to do that. And you might have to mitigate. You might be told you can't dig there. And the kind of question at issue is that the Clean Water Act is jurisdictional over quote unquote waters of the United States, but that has not been well defined in statute, and different presidential administrations have kind of redefined it over and over again with the change of party or change of perspective. So the Trump rules narrowed it as would be expected. And we started having conversations again as a member of a much larger coalition with our state level agencies, the Department of Public Health and Environment, saying, this kind of ping pong action between, a Democrat and Republican, we constantly are having to change the coverage. And that's not good for wildlife and wetlands. And it's probably not good. I'm not going to try and speak for them, but it's probably not great for regulated entities that they want some certainty. They probably want certainty at a narrower level than the conservation community would want, but we all want certainty. What are we talking about? What's in, what's out? Following that rule, the Supreme Court issued a decision in their Sackett decision, which looked at kind of wetlands and really further narrowed beyond the Trump rule, which wetlands would be jurisdictional, would be covered under the Clean Water Act. And, the state of Colorado and the Nature Conservancy and others just felt like we know what's important in Colorado better than the Supreme Court when it comes to waters of the West. So let's just define this ourselves. Let's figure out what's acceptable to the conservation community and hopefully to agricultural users and the regulated industry. So again, this one really was just a different kind of coalition than I think that the Nature Conservancy is typically involved in, because a lot of the natural resource work that we do is not really regulatory. A lot of it's market based, and this is a very hotly contested regulatory issue, and we ended up trying to find common ground not just with the regulated community, but there's differences of opinion among the environmental community about how far this should go, and what's politically viable under our state administration. What's the role of kind of citizen suits and the ability for citizens to litigate for violations? And I will say that in general, this is a little bit broad strokes again, but from the Nature Conservancy's perspective, obviously we want to make sure that we have the strongest environmental protections in place as we can. We also want to maintain our relationships with regulated community and with kind of agricultural and kind of rural areas, so we can continue to do good work in partnership. And really taking that long view is important. And I'm not suggesting it's not important for other groups, but it is really paramount for us that kind of the policy is important, but the people are critical. And these are the kind of people and communities that we're going to have to keep working with. So kind of fast forwarding, there was eventually legislation passed last session that I think was a good compromise between the various perspectives. And we're, as I mentioned, still at the table, engaged in the rulemaking that's ongoing to implement that statute, really focused on the kind of science and process behind the mitigation requirements that'll come if you are going to build in a jurisdictional water. What kind of mitigation standards are needed? Because that's kind of our bread and butter, is saying this is what the science says, this is what's needed for a healthy stream or wetland, looking to other mitigation bank programs and making sure that we can set up a good foundation. So we feel like if a project has to move forward in one of these jurisdictional waters, we're doing the best we can to mitigate those impacts through strong science, good projects, good sideboards. So that's kind of been our role there, is really been as a member of the chorus, but hopefully an important one in trying to focus on the need for compromise as opposed to really, leading from the front.
Now, when you're doing this work, like on this specific project, how much of what you're doing or your team or this coalition, how much of it is actually meeting with elected officials, public officials versus, I don't know whether it's passing along information or gathering information and putting it in a way that presents the side of the story that you guys are telling. I mean, like, I'm just curious about the actual work involved in that and how you go about getting this information to the people who make the decisions, if that makes sense.
It does. And, it's going to depend on the specific situation. In that example that you just talked about with the rollback Clean Water Act jurisdiction, like I mentioned, our role was relatively small. And full disclosure, I left on paternity leave for the last 6 weeks or so of the legislative session. So I was not present and probably can't take too much credit for the final form, because you
were working hard, though.
I was working hard on something different. But in this case, we played a smaller role. We did absolutely engage with the various sponsors, had conversations with some of the more important lobby groups with whom we have relationships, like the Cattlemen's Association, the Farm Bureau, to kind of check notes and say, what are you thinking? What's your most important issue? Just so we're aware. Not that that's necessarily going to determine our position, but you want to know what you're, who you're going to upset if you say one thing or go a different direction, because all of that is relevant, particularly to the long-term opportunities. We also spent some time working directly with the agency, with Department of Public Health and Environment, and also with Department of Natural Resources and Parks and Wildlife, who have a lot of expertise on the wildlife and the kind of aquatic habitat side. But if I can, in a different scenario where we were, I think, much more at the front, was a number of years ago. I want to say in 2019, maybe. You might have talked to some folks in the past about the Yampa River Fund, which is a
Carlos and I have talked about that many times. Yeah,
and it was basically the community up in Steamboat in particular, but all throughout Routt County, came together and said, we want to make sure that there's money available annually to invest in the Yampa River. And one of the projects that was always considered critical to that was having a pot of money available to pay for releases from Stagecoach Reservoir to kind of keep that river flowing and keep temperatures down for fish and for recreation late in the summer. A number of years ago, we were using a tool, an in-stream flow leasing tool that was time limited. You could only use it a number of times, and then your certification ran out, basically. And we were able to be creative, us and really the Colorado Water Trust, who was kind of on point for those transactions. But we were kind of running out of options, and thought, wouldn't it be better just to, rather than finding all these workarounds, let's just change the program and say, if you've got willing partners, you can continue to do these kind of short-term transactions to protect rivers for more years. It's still not permanent, but you can have them kind of approved by the state engineer, and you can renew them rather than them running out after a couple of years. So we were hearing that from our project partners in the Yampa and Steamboat, saying, we can figure this out, but it's getting a little more complicated. We said, okay, what's a solution? Can we change the law in a way that allows this to move forward? But again, we would have to continue to work with the reservoir owners. We want to make sure that we're not creating controversy in the community that generally are supportive of the Yampa River Fund. It's a market-based transaction. We're not forcing anyone to do anything they don't want to do. So that was a real back and forth. We worked with the community and the Yampa River Fund folks to say, what do you need to make this as successful as possible? We then went and worked directly with the sponsors, and Senator Dylan Roberts is one of the prime sponsors, and he grew up in Steamboat and spent time going to Carpenter Ranch, our preserve, and really knew the river and knew the community. We talked to him about the proposal, and then I spent, frankly, quite a bit of time working with kind of the agricultural community, water users, trying to address their concerns, many of them legitimate, about how, hey, if we do this wrong, I'm going to get harmed. This is going to injure my water rights. No one's goal, but trying to kind of fill those gaps, make sure there was appropriate notice, standards to really say we're working within the system. We're just saying there's a demand for this tool. Let's make sure that it works. And we were working with, again, the government agency who would have to oversee it. Can the state engineer do what we're asking him to do? How do we build this in a way that makes sense? Does this make sense legally from the state's perspective and from the kind of agricultural community? So that was, I think, a really great example of us kind of playing that role, learning from our on-the-ground practitioners, and then I could be kind of the liaison, saying we're not just talking in generalities. There's a specific place where this tool is needed, and we've seen it used more and more since we passed it, and it's continued to be expanded as we learn, like, there's a couple different things we could tweak to make this even more effective. So, that's really the role we've been able to play, is to find that sweet spot between what do we need on the ground and what can we do legislatively, and hopefully people are still, we're still doing the project, so we haven't completely pissed everybody off to the point that they don't want to talk anymore.
Well, that's what I admire about TNC and really any successful NGO. I mean, my wife used to work for a international development organization, and that was very successful. And they had the same approach of show up in the community, build relationships, and just come with this tone of, what do you need? How can we help? We've got all these resources, versus somebody in Washington, D.C. showing up like in Thailand and saying, we've got your solution. We know what you need. And I think TNC just really, really, really embodies that in everything they do. So I love hearing that. So thinking about policy, the question I want to ask, but I've learned the hard way not to ask this kind of question. I want to ask, what makes you so good at your job versus people that may not, you're A plus, there are plenty of people that are B or B plus. Why are you so much better? But what I've learned is that everybody I have on here is humble and they refuse to answer that question. So I'm going to rephrase it into what makes somebody really good at policy work versus somebody who, is average, kind of gets it done. But like in your mind, from the experience you've seen and all the people you've worked with over the years, what makes a great policy team that can get things done and keep the community as happy as as could be on the particular issues?
I like that you framed it as a team, because so much of it does depend on having a team that you can rely on, either for those relationships, and in many cases for the kind of subject matter expertise. And
Sure.
My background happens to be in water, so I have a pretty good background in those issues, and I can sit down in those conversations and generally know what everybody's talking about and can help find kind of solutions in the text. If you give me a bill working on water, I can identify, oh, this is going to be an issue and that's going to be a problem. I mentioned that increasingly I'm working on kind of renewable energy. And that's a space that I'm learning, and I've been really enjoying learning about it. But I am not an expert on the ins and outs of the Public Utilities Commission or the way that the tax incentives from the IRA are going to accelerate, or now if they go away, delay the build out and transition to renewables. That is an area that I understand it's a batch of issues, but I will definitely rely on folks on my team. You mentioned people like Peter Gower, other folks here in Colorado, on my team, who can provide that. And one of the great things about the Nature Conservancy is that we do have people and relationships in these communities where we want to work. That doesn't mean everything always works out and people always trust us, but we have a presence in Northwest Colorado along the Yampa River, and we've been there for decades. We've got a presence in Southeastern Colorado. We have staff that live down there. We've been working with those communities forever. Again, people still might not agree with or like what we're doing, but they know we're not just swooping in and leaving 6 months later. We have a presence, we have places that we own and manage, and we have relationships that are really important. So I think it is a little bit of a mix between having enough subject matter expertise or knowing when you don't know something and asking questions, and then having genuine relationships that are not purely transactional. And I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation how much I think I'd learned from those conversations for hours driving around on ranches near Tucson, Arizona with these ranchers. And I do think some of it goes back to that, because I certainly had a lot of preconceived notions about what they were thinking about, whether it was they're right along the border, and they were right at the forefront of some of these issues around border crossings and smuggling, and getting their perspective. These are people who were actually walking across their ranches and hearing their stories about how they're handling that. Had nothing to do necessarily with conservation, but it kind of opened my eyes to remind me that all of these people have really unique experiences, and also having them talk about their connection to place. And while I see it as a big conservation opportunity, this is a place that their families have owned and managed for generations, and they might value different pieces of it than I do, and they want nothing more than to protect that and to protect their investment for their family, which I think everybody can accept. So just being really good at listening, understanding, and being honest about your perspective. I'm here with the Nature Conservancy. My primary goal might be to protect this habitat or to protect this river. Your primary goal might be to have a profitable agricultural operation. Let's figure out if those can be consistent, or at least be honest about where we disagree. And I think that's something that I try to do. I'm not going to go in and try to advocate for farmers and ranchers. I want them to do well, but they can do that themselves. And I think it's much more effective if we're kind of honest and direct about what we're after, and take the time to listen, and also take the time to be educated about what the issues are. Because I do feel like there's a lot of people in this space who can sometimes play a little fast and loose with the details. And I'll definitely be honest when I don't understand something, and either find somebody to support me or just ask a ton of questions so I can at least get up to kind of a remedial level to have a helpful conversation.
I completely agree with that. I mean, earlier you said, you're not a cowboy and you don't dress up like one. And I've always had that same approach, both when I was in the real estate business working with ranchers, and then when I was in the conservation world working with farmers and ranchers. I mean, it's an advantage that I have this Southern accent, because there's no way I can trick anybody. Like the minute I open my mouth, everybody knows I'm not from here. So I just embrace like, hey, I'm from Eastern North Carolina. I'm from the beach. Can you please, I want to understand what you do. And I think just being very straightforward, very authentic, and very curious about what you don't know, it's worked for me. And it sounds like and I know it's worked very, very well for you. And so many of the people at TNC, you think about Matt Moorhead out on the eastern plains of Colorado, and he's from Pennsylvania, I believe. And he's not a rancher, but man, you all talk about a guy who's got deep, 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 powerful relationships with the ranching community, and he's the guy. Anyway, I really admire that.
But it's definitely all those people, Matt and others, who kind of allow me to be successful, and allow the Nature Conservancy to be successful, because there's always that joke that, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help. I'm here from the conservation community, and I'm here to help. And that's never going to open a door for you. But I can go in and say, hey, I know Matt. We work a lot on conservation easement policy, incentives for conservation easements. That was a much more controversial topic when I worked for a land trust in the early to mid 2000s than it is now. But it's still, not everybody loves it. There's a lot of questions about the perpetual nature of these things, and there's a lot of misinformation. And because we have built those relationships through people like Matt or JJ Autry or others who kind of live down, this is in,
JJ is awesome. I love
he's amazing. And we can say, hey, I'm with them. You can at least hopefully trust me enough to hear me out. That makes all the conversations so much easier, because it's trite, but trust really does matter. And just being able to say, I'm with them. I'm not trying to do anything crazy. If I say anything wrong, you can tell me. And it comes from it's maybe comes from a place of ignorance, and it doesn't come from a place of malice. So I think that's really, really a valuable thing. And it's why the Nature Conservancy has been such, and I'm not here to just stump for the organization, but it allows me to be so much more successful, because I can kind of stand on the shoulders of all these people and all these relationships that we've built here in Colorado for almost 60 years. And it does matter. And it's important to me to not screw up their relationships by saying something stupid.
That's the thing.
It kind of goes both ways. Yeah.
It definitely does. When I think about this podcast, one of my goals is, if somebody stumbles across this episode 4 years from now, they're going to get just as much value and cool stories and cool information as they would if they'd listened to it the day it came out. And so I don't like talking about too many current events, but at this moment when we're recording this in the late winter of 2025, there's definitely a lot of chaos, I guess is the word I would use, on the federal level. And so my question is not about specifics about that, but it's more about how you and your team and TNC, how do you decide or think about focusing on federal policy versus state policy? And I think now is probably a good time to think about which way you're going to go on that, or which one's going to receive focus. And so I'm just curious how you think about where you focus on the particular policy work you're doing.
Yeah, and it is tough. And, I'll say the Nature Conservancy nationally and globally is being really intentional and trying to kind of understand as much as possible the implications of the changes at the federal level, the executive orders, and everything else that's kind of coming down the pike. And we do continue to want to do everything we can to protect our foundational environmental laws. And a lot of that's going to require continuing to work with folks in DC. And a lot of those have bipartisan support, despite kind of some of the rhetoric right now. And so we're really good at kind of, again, maintaining those partnerships with with folks on both sides of the aisle and talking about this from a science-based perspective, that this is important because it affects your pocketbook or your way of life or you're a hunter or whatever it is. So we haven't given up on that. But we also are really redoubling our focus in the states, and particularly in states like Colorado, both because a lot of our kind of conservation priorities touch down here geographically, whether that's kind of the Colorado River, the Sagebrush Sea, the Southern High Plains. There's a lot of focus on, like I mentioned, renewable energy build out here, kind of our dry forest ecosystems. So there's a lot that we care about. It's in Colorado as part of these larger systems. And Colorado has, we hear about some of the chaos politically in Colorado if you read the Denver Post or otherwise, but we have a pretty, a well-functioning political system here.
Seems like it to me.
We work across the aisle all the time. We work with Republicans and Democrats on most, if not all, of our priorities. We can find people who say, yeah, I grew up in the San Luis Valley. I care about this. It doesn't matter if I have a D or an R after my name. Let's work together on this. So we can do a lot of great work kind of without the partisan ugliness in places like Colorado. It's not, there's still political challenges, whether it's disagreements among, different factions of each party or across the, political divide. But there's a ton of opportunities here. And so many decisions about things we care about are made, or at least are maybe not made, but influenced at the state level. Definitely a lot of water is managed at the state level. There's a federal role, but we have a lot of control over it. When we're talking about conservation easements, there's critical funding programs like GOCO. We have a state tax credit for conservation easements, and that really affects and kind of influences our ability to get conservation done on the ground. And then again, we talked about energy. A lot of decisions about energy siting are made not at the state level, but at the local government, at the county level. So yes, what happens in Washington obviously matters. I mentioned the potential rollback of some IRA programs that could delay a transition to renewable energy. That's going to be a problem. But the work is still going to have to happen at the state level. And we have so many opportunities to do great work here, regardless of who's in the White House. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it. And it is a good time to really refocus on what we can do state by state, but got to keep an eye on what's happening in DC to kind of make sure that we don't undermine too many of those foundational programs that we rely on.
There's a calmness about the way you and TNC in general, and really most effective organizations go about this work. When you look at the news or you make the mistake of surfing the internet and checking out current events, everything just seems so frantic and crazy. But I was talking about this with my little girls the other day. Like, I don't know of a single situation in life where you're better off by being frantic and flustered. I think being calm. And it seems like TNC, for its many, many decades of history, is just kind of observes what's going on and keeps moving forward without, there's obviously a sense of urgency with everything you do, but I think just keeping that calm perspective, it's whether or not it is effective, but even if it weren't, it just makes me feel better right now. So thank you.
Well, I wish I could. I'm glad I exude calm and the organization does the same. I'm not going to pretend that I'm particularly calm as an individual.
You seem scary. Like it. You should be an actor.
Yeah. And, I've got our first, an 11-month-old little boy, and definitely thinking a lot about making sure that these special places like where I grew up and in Colorado are still here and accessible and protected for him. So, there's some lead time before he's going to be out, climbing any 14ers. But, again, it's important, I think, to take the long view, but I'm not going to pretend that I'm always particularly calm about this. So it's good that that's the outward perspective, and it is what we're trying to focus on, at least as long as we can. So I'll take that to heart and try to pretend I'm calm a little longer.
Well, for a most extreme example of this, and I'm sorry for the listeners who have to listen to me talk about this again, but I started doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu at age 46. I decided that would be a good idea to start. And it's just a straight up fight. You're fighting with people. But the big takeaway is the way you get better at it is by calming down. If you're just going crazy, there's nothing, you're completely ineffective and you're going to get beat. And so I found, like, if of all things, physical fighting, the key is to calm down. I think it's kind of the key is to calm down in everything. There can be a sense of urgency but that's just I'm tight, very, very tightly wound, and I always have been, but I'm slowly calming down. So, thank you for your example. And you're a very good actor. You ought to do community theater.
And we're speaking of calm, or the lack of it. I do spend a lot of time at our state capitol. And while I think it's effective as we get closer and closer to the end of session in early May, the days and nights get longer. We're kind of haven't talked about it, but, we've got a pretty dire budget situation here in Colorado, which is going to affect, funding for conservation, a lot of things we care about. And that's just inevitable right now. And we could have a whole hour talking about the causes of that. But I have a feeling that calm will be stripped away in the final weeks when, I or others are testifying at 3 a.m. on some of our priority bills. So maybe this is the calm before the storm, even though, again, we've got, a lot of folks that we work with on all these issues, and there's, broad support for a lot of, not everything, but a lot of what we work on. We won't be spared from the chaos down at our Capitol in the next couple of months. So maybe if we
Can I come follow you around? Yeah. I'll follow you around the microphone as everything's getting real heated up.
Yeah, I think there will be a lot of microphones there, and hopefully they'll be focused on more controversial issues. But we'll be kind of swept along in all that chaos come April, May.
Well, I'm glad to know they're working hard on it. Seriously, it is super inspiring and important. When you mentioned you studied history, that already got me thinking about one of my final questions about books. And I'm always curious. I'm always looking for book recommendations from folks, and they could be about conservation. They could be about the West, could be about history in your case, or it could just be an important novel you read at some point that kind of directed you on this career path you've been on. But I'm curious if you have any book recommendations for me.
I knew you were going to ask, and I mean, the obvious one that's most directly focused on my work, which I'm sure you've read and you've probably told your readers about, is The Emerald Mile. Is a great book about the Colorado River. So I thought that was too easy, but I love that, and I always recommend it because it does such a good job kind of telling a story about the Colorado River, but also you get excited about infrastructure and dams in a way you never thought you would. So that's a great one, but I did think of another one, pulled it off my bookshelf, and it's been a long time since I've read it, but I pulled down The Fool's Progress by Edward Abbey, which is a novel. And it starts in the town that he ended up, he died in Tucson. And so later in his life, he lived in Tucson. And there's a really, in my mind, iconic scene at the beginning of him just kind of sweating in his kitchen, listening to his refrigerator make a lot of noise in 100 and something degree heat. But I read this book, I think when I was in law school. It's really a road trip journey of a kind of a little bit distraught older man. It's semi-autobiographical. And it's funny because, Edward Abbey probably doesn't embody the kind of, partnership, collaborative approach that I try to embody. That is not what he kind of cut his teeth on. That is not the kind of writing that he does. But I still love his writing. I think the way that he can write about the West and landscapes and human connections to it can't be beat. So I love it. It's a novel. It's a little bit about the West. It's more about kind of an aging man, kind of getting in his truck and maybe having a little bit of a mid to late life crisis. But it was a great one, and it definitely has a connection to the West and to where I was born in Tucson, Arizona.
That's great. I have not read that, but sounds interesting. I had on this podcast a while back, maybe a year or two ago, I interviewed Doug Peacock, and he talked about in that episode about actually burying Ed Abbey. Like, he was one of the guys, he dug the grave And then he says this in the podcast, he dug the grave and then he laid down in the grave to make sure it was big enough. And then so he's one of the, two or three people who knows where he's buried. Isn't that crazy?
So funnily enough, and I was debating whether to mention this, when I was reading this book, there was a coffee shop in Tucson right near university. It's not there anymore. And I used to go there and study and read and just drink coffee. And I was reading this book sitting at a table just out in the coffee shop. And there's a guy that was always sitting in the coffee shop wearing kind of an old army jacket. He looked kind of menacing, and I'd never talked to him. And he just walked over and he said, I knew Ed near the end of his life. And he told me some stories about how, I don't know if they were best buddies. I don't know if he was making it up, but he told me this whole story about how he used to see Ed Abbey around town. And he implied that he had some ideas about where he was born. Where he was buried. I don't know if he was there. I don't know if he was pulling my leg or just, spinning a tail, but that's part of the reason that I kind of love this book, is that moment was so interesting. I mean, it was believable. The guy came over and chatted with me, and I've completely forgotten his name if I ever knew it, but would always say hello to this guy who otherwise probably never would have been somebody I would have talked to. So yeah, it's fascinating, but it is kind of there's very few people, and there will be even fewer people soon who know where he's buried, but supposedly it's near Tucson somewhere out in the desert.
What a wild, that whole group of people, that whole generation of people from, Ed Abbey to Peacock, and even writers like Tom McGuane. And, that's a generation that's kind of phasing out. And I'm always curious. I wonder 50 years from now, who's going to take their place, Well, you've been so generous with your time. I really appreciate it. You've got a lot more important stuff to do than answer all my crazy questions. But final question for you is, any parting words of wisdom? You've seen so much, you've done so much, you've really devoted your whole career to this super important work. You've got a brand new human on earth that you're raising. What are you thinking about? How do you want to close this out?
I don't feel like I'm old or experienced enough to have words of wisdom, but
that's what everybody says.
Maybe I am. I've talked a lot about kind of partnerships and relationships, and I continue to think that that's so critical, because when we look back in the rearview mirror at the issues we're fighting over, the details are going to matter less than if you can kind of still pick up the phone and call some of the people that you were on the same or the opposite side with. And that's kind of what I've focused on more than anything in my career, and hopefully my life, is how important, human connections are. We spend so much time thinking about places and rivers and mountains, and those are important. I mean, that's what I work on day to day. But I do try to think about the people behind it, and, we've all got legitimate perspectives, and we don't have to agree on everything. And, I remember a conversation that I had multiple times with Terry Fankhauser, who was the head of Colorado Cattlemen's Association until he unfortunately passed a couple of years ago. And he was a big and sometimes scary man who
I knew
became a friend. And he and I would frequently disagree, but we didn't have to be disagreeable about it, and we could kind of joke with each other afterwards, and we could, get on the stand at the Capitol and testify in different directions, and then chat in the hallway about family and, just honest perspectives. And that's the kind of relationship that I strive to have with everybody that I agree with or disagree with. And, I think if we can all focus on that, and if we can have more Terrys in the world, I think we'd be in a better place, certainly in the conservation arena. So that's kind of a rambling way to talk about it, but those relationships are kind of what allows us to make progress. Even if we don't completely agree, we generally want the same thing in the end, and I think it allows us to take the time we need to get to that point, even if it takes a couple twists and turns that weren't expected along the way.
Man, I love it. This was so fun. I feel like I was talking to an old buddy. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time, man. I really, really appreciate it. And I'll look forward to hanging out in person one of these days.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was really fun. Appreciate the opportunity to chat. Hey,
it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable. So so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way, so head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.